Senator Cramer, welcome back. I don't know, you probably didn't hear my riff about how Europe is buying Russian LNG and sending as much money to Russia via that as they are sending to the Ukraine to fight for freedom and democracy. But I'm sure you know about this whole story. It was a Breitbart story. It's being picked up elsewhere. It's part of the insanity that we have not yet turned the spigots back on. So I make my perennial plea to you. Are we going to have H.R. 1 in the House? Are we going to have a bill that'll open up the spigots again?
Well, I think it'd be great if Kevin McCarthy's very narrow House majority takes up an H.R. 1 and does some type of a permitting reform or regulatory reform quickly that they could send over to the Senate that we could at least take up. I don't know that, that it would get out of Chuck Schumer's top drawer. That's the problem, but nonetheless, we ought to do it anyway, because I do think that Democrats in this very narrowly divided political situation, which was certainly exemplified last night in Georgia, is a good example of just how narrow it is. And maybe, just maybe, with a map that's not as favorable to Democrats in the next election, they would see their way to do something reasonable. I just came from a classified briefing about Ukraine with all of the people that you know, and believe me, going into this very difficult winter in Europe without Russian gas for all of Europe is really, scary. It's not them wanting to help Vladimir Putin. It's them wanting to survive this winter. And we have not stepped up the way we could and should have stepped up as a nation that produces a lot of natural gas and oil. And it's a national security risk, an economic risk, and really just dumb policy.
We begged them several years ago.
Yes.
I was the greatest LNG salesman in history with no commissions asked. Every European leader. And they would give us lip service and nothing would happen. And Angela Merkel refused to open up refineries until it was too late. And then here at home, I mean, if we were producing 50 million barrels a day, oil prices would be at $45 a barrel, and Vladimir Putin would be finished. He'd be back riding his brown horse with no shirt on. I mean, we've helped him do this from day one. And now the Europeans are giving him all this money so they can import his LNG. And Lord knows what China and India are doing to help the guy. I mean, it's just driving me crazy. What happened, by the way, Manchin, Manchin who double-crossed everybody on the Inflation Reduction Bill, whatever happened to his hardcore promise to have permitting? Schumer and Pelosi said, no, that's gone, right? As I understand, it's completely out the window.
It is completely out the window. It's been taken off the NDAA, and by the way, for good reason. The reasons I didn't support the package, a package that I helped work with Joe Manchin on very closely, was because they ended before we could agree on something, particularly as it relates to federalizing the electric grid, which is really an enhancement to the Green New Deal. So the reforms that they were promoting weren't reforms our direction, they were reforms to the left that would, for example, socialize the costs nationally, socialize the costs for very localized Green New Deal type of generation facilities. And that's just plain wrong. That's not reform. Now, there were some good reforms, perhaps on the other side, for things like oil and gas and pipelines and whatnot, and I'd be supportive of those. But on net, it was worse than doing nothing, and worse than doing nothing is not a compromise.
So what happens? Shelley Moore Capito's got a bill out there. In other words, right, if there is such a thing as an H.R. 1, I mean, actually, Steve Scalise was suggesting to me that we could have an H.R. 1. To open the spigots. He even asked me if I'd testify on its behalf. I said I'd make an exception for the first time in years and go down and do it. That's what a desperate man I am. But suppose you got something out of the House. Does GOP senators, do you all have something you can put on the docket and say, here's the thing we need to do?
Well, just remember, in the Senate, the majority leader controls the entire floor. And things, I was a young congressman that introduced the very first bill that we passed in 2015, and that was greenlighting the Keystone XL pipeline. That was my bill. It passed. I got lots of bipartisan support, including the Congressional Black Caucus members, several of them. It went over to the Senate where Senator Reid put it in the top drawer, and we never heard from it again. So that's the problem you have in the Senate, particularly now with the 51-49 minority. That one vote, those two votes really that separate us from the majority, make it difficult. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, Larry. I still think we need to put these things forward. We need the American public to see the contrast, and I'd be all about it.
That's right. That's right. Great spirit. Senator Kevin Cramer.